They called it justice. But inside Stalin's gulags, justice meant starvation, forced labor, and a bullet to the head. Entire families vanished behind barbed wire, guilty of nothing but existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Mothers, poets, soldiers, erased like they never lived. A single man's obsession turned an entire nation into its own executioner. It all started in 1929 when Joseph Stalin officially became the absolute leader of the Soviet Union. After removing rivals like Leon Trotsky and gaining control of the Communist Party, he began transforming the country into a dictatorship ruled by fear. To protect his power and eliminate opposition, Stalin turned to mass repression. That same year, he authorized the expansion of a secret prison network run by the OGPU, an early form of the Soviet police. This system later became known as the Gulag. The word Gulag stood for Glavno Upravlение Lagery, or Main Camp Administration. But it wasn't just a name. It was the foundation of one of the most brutal systems in modern history. The Gulags weren't regular prisons. They were remote labor camps built across the Soviet Union, stretching from the icy Kolyma in the east to the forests of Karelia in the west. Some were located in the Arctic Circle, where temperatures could drop below minus 50 degrees Celsius. In these camps, inmates were forced to build railways, dig mines, cut timber, and construct entire towns. Conditions were brutal: freezing cold, starvation-level food, and no medical help. The camps weren't designed to rehabilitate people. They were designed to break them. By the end of 1929, over 50,000 people had been sent to these camps. Many of them weren't criminals at all. Some were peasants labeled as kulaks for owning too much land. Others were workers accused of being lazy or politically unreliable. Even being late to work or making a joke about the government could get someone arrested. One of the first large camps set up during this time was Verkha Uralnska, used for political prisoners. Another, Svilag, was opened near Leningrad. These early camps were testing grounds for what would later become a massive empire of forced labor. The system was expanding fast, and it was only the beginning. Between 1930 and 1932, the Gulag system started showing its darkest side. These early years were not yet the height of mass executions, but they were the beginning. Prisoners began disappearing from camps without explanation. At first, the killings weren't part of official policy, but local camp leaders were given so much unchecked power that they acted on their own. Armed with vague orders from above and full control over inmates, commanders and guards decided who lived and who didn't. The executions were done quietly. A prisoner might be taken at night under the excuse of disciplinary action or interrogation and never seen again. There was no due process. Accusations were often based on rumors, minor arguments, or simple disobedience. In many cases, the killings happened in remote parts of the camp, behind barracks, near the tree line, or the woods nearby. A few prisoners would be forced to dig shallow pits, then shot one by one. Solovki, located on the Solovetsky Islands in the White Sea, became one of the most notorious early execution sites. It had originally been a monastery before being turned into a labor camp. Between 1931 and 1932, over 1,100 prisoners were executed there. Most of them were political prisoners, including intellectuals, writers, teachers, priests, and former Tsarist officials. The killings at Solovki were often done in secret at night. Guards would take groups of prisoners to a forest area called Sakirnaya Gora. They were shot and buried in mass graves. Others were thrown into the freezing sea or nearby lakes, making recovery impossible. One of the first large executions there took place in October 1931, when 509 prisoners were killed in a single week. This event was never reported or recorded officially at the time. Only years later did historians piece it together through archives and survivor accounts. Other early Gulag camps also saw similar killings. At Svirlag, More than 400 people were executed by early 1932. Many were accused of planning revolts, but in reality, most had simply complained about food or work conditions. The guards faced no punishment. In fact, some were promoted for efficiency in removing enemies. This unofficial pattern of killing soon became routine. Bodies were often buried in frozen ground that was barely dug deep enough. Some graves were found decades later with bones still wearing rusted handcuffs. These first executions set the tone, but the worst was yet to come. In 1937, Stalin began one of the deadliest campaigns in Soviet history, the Great Terror, also known as the Great Purge. It was a massive effort to wipe out anyone who might be a threat to his power, even if they had done nothing wrong. Between August 1937 and November 1938, Soviet police and intelligence officers arrested more than 1.5 million people. Now, these weren't just soldiers or activists. They were teachers, farmers, engineers, artists, and even some Communist Party members. Out of those arrested, about 681,692 were executed by shooting. Most were never given a real trial. Many were sent straight to the gulags, where conditions were already deadly. But now, mass executions inside the camps became normal. In Kolyma, daily shootings became part of camp life. The region, especially Sevostlag, Northeast Corrective Labor Camp, became known as the Land of White Death. In 1938 alone, over 9,000 prisoners died from either execution, starvation, or extreme cold. In Butujichag, a uranium mining camp also located in the Far East, the death rate was even higher. Prisoners who collapsed during the back-breaking labor were either shot immediately or left behind in the snow to freeze. The uranium dust they breathed in also caused deadly radiation sickness. By the end of 1938, more than 2,500 prisoners at Butujichag were dead, many from direct gunfire. In Karelia, a region near the Finnish border, the executions became highly organized. One of the top NKVD officials there, Mikhail Matviev, personally signed off on thousands of killings. At the Sandarmokh site alone, over 7,000 prisoners were executed between August and December 1937. Many were from Solovki prison. The killings were not random. They followed signed orders, schedules, and quotas. Stalin sent out what were called shooting lists, personally approving names of people who were to be executed. NKVD officers like Nikolai Yezhov were given targets. One such list, dated September 1938, ordered the execution of 318 prisoners in a single day at a camp near Novosibirsk. They were shot at night and buried in mass graves. Despite the high number of killings, the Soviets kept detailed records. Each execution had a document, often with the prisoner's name, accusation, and method of death. These documents were stamped top secret and locked away, but many survived and were later discovered in the 1990s. The people executed there were not just criminals. In fact, most had never committed any real crime at all. One major group targeted was farmers, especially during Stalin's campaign of forced collectivization in the early 1930s. Those who refused to hand over their grain or livestock were labeled as enemies of socialism. Entire families were arrested. Many were executed after being accused of sabotage just for hiding food to survive. Teachers and professors were another group often arrested. Some were accused of teaching anti-Soviet ideas, even if all they did was mention foreign books or question harsh policies. Priests were especially at risk. The Soviet government viewed religion as dangerous. By the mid-1930s, hundreds of Orthodox Christian clergy were arrested and executed after being sent to labor camps like Siblag and Temlag. Children and teenagers were not spared. Boys as young as 12 were charged with stealing bread or simply being related to someone labeled an enemy. At the camp named Usolag, near the Ural Mountains, over 3,000 miners were registered between 1935 and 1938. Many died from overwork, disease, or were executed when accused of organizing minor protests. Stalin also saw ethnic minorities as a threat. In 1937, he launched several national operations targeting people based on their background, not their actions. During the Polish operation, over 140,000 Poles living in the USSR were arrested. At least 111,000 were executed. Latvians, Estonians, Germans, Koreans, Greeks, and Iranians living in Soviet territory were also swept up. At Gulags, a large camp in Kazakhstan, trains filled with ethnic Germans and Koreans arrived regularly. Many were executed upon arrival, or died within months due to mistreatment. One notable case was Reinhold Brzezinski, a Latvian-born Soviet general who had once fought for the Bolsheviks. Despite his service, he was arrested in 1937 for being part of a Latvian nationalist plot. He was sent to the Komunarka execution site and shot the same year. His family never found out where he was buried. Even loyal communists weren't safe. Being part of the party offered no protection. In fact, many longtime party members were accused of being Trotskyists or spies. One report from 1938 showed that over 30% of Gulag executions that year were against people who were once members of the Communist Party themselves. Fear became the only thing that was truly alive inside those camps, and it spread everywhere without warning. Death wasn't just something that happened over time. It was planned, ordered, and carried out with terrifying precision. The methods used to kill prisoners were not just meant to eliminate them. They were designed to instill fear in everyone else still alive. The most common method of execution was a single gunshot to the back of the head. It was fast, left little mess, and required no trial. Prisoners were usually blindfolded or forced to kneel. The location could be a cold basement, a back room, or a forest clearing. The bullet was often fired from a Nagant M1895 revolver, the standard issue for NKVD officers. At Komunarka, an execution site just outside of Moscow, this method was used almost every night during the Great Terror. Some prisoners were forced to dig their own graves before being shot. Prisoners were marched deep into the woods, given shovels, and told to dig. Once the hole was ready, they were shot and rolled in. Sometimes other prisoners were forced to help with the digging, knowing they might be next. In Vorkuta, one of the coldest gulags in the Arctic, executions took on another form. Instead of bullets, nature was the weapon. Guards would choose prisoners they saw as troublemakers and send them outside during freezing storms without coats, gloves, or boots. Temperatures often dropped to minus 40 degrees Celsius or lower. Prisoners were told to stand in formation or walk in circles until they collapsed. There was no shooting, no shouting, just silence. The guards stood and watched until the last body fell. The tools weren't always guns. In some rare cases, ice picks, clubs, or bayonets were used when bullets were limited. Especially during times of transport or revolt, these brutal alternatives became the method of control. Women faced horrors just as brutal as men, and in many cases, worse. The Soviet government didn't see gender as a reason to show mercy. Many women were not arrested for anything they had done, but simply because of who they were related to. Stalin's idea of guilt extended through families. It was called kin punishment. If a man was accused of treason, his wife could be taken away the next day, even if she knew nothing about his case. One of the most notorious sites was Alzhir, the Akmola camp for wives of traitors to the motherland in modern-day Kazakhstan. Open in 1938, it became a place where thousands of innocent women were locked away. Over 8,000 women passed through Alzhir, and hundreds were executed after short, brutal interrogations. Some had newborn babies. Others were pregnant. None of that stopped the NKVD. Women who gave birth inside the camps were sometimes executed days later. Their babies were taken to orphanages, where many of them died from hunger and illness. One well-known case is Lydia Ruslanova, a folk singer arrested in 1939 for performing songs that were considered anti-Stalin. She was tortured for weeks in a Moscow prison. accused of spreading anti-Soviet messages. After a brief hearing, she was executed and buried in an unmarked grave. Reports from Temlag, another Gulag camp, describe women being forced to strip naked before execution, left exposed to freezing temperatures. Some were used in forced medical experiments before being killed. In Krasnoyarsk, between 1937 and 1938, NKVD records show that 2,000 women were executed, many for the simple charge of associating with political enemies. Others were accused of espionage simply because they spoke foreign languages or had worked abroad. Inside the gulags, women were often subjected to sexual abuse by guards and interrogators. Complaints were ignored. If a woman fought back or refused, she risked being added to an execution list. Being a woman didn't mean safety. It often meant more pain, more silence, and a death no one would ever admit happened. Now, as 1940s approached and World War II began, the Soviet Union was invaded by Nazi Germany in June 1941. While most of the world focused on the battlefield, Stalin turned his attention back to the camps. He feared that prisoners, especially from border areas, might join the Germans or leak Soviet secrets. So he gave orders that no prisoner should fall into enemy hands. This led to mass executions in areas close to the front lines. In Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states, thousands were shot just days or even hours before German troops arrived. In Lviv, Ukraine, nearly 3,000 prisoners were executed between June 22nd and June 24, 1941, as the NKVD rushed to evacuate. Bodies were dumped in courtyards, cellars, and water wells. Locals later discovered them as the Germans marched in. In Vilnius, Kaunas, and Tallinn, similar patterns were seen. Inmates were killed in prison yards, their bodies burned or hidden in trenches. Some were still wearing their prison uniforms when found. In the Zaporizhia region, guards at a transit camp opened fire on hundreds of prisoners during a failed evacuation. Survivors reported that the gates were locked and grenades were thrown into the cells. During these wartime purges, ethnic prisoners were heavily targeted. Stalin feared that Lithuanians, Estonians, Latvians, and Volga Germans would welcome the Nazis. So many were executed without investigation. At Solilnetsk, a camp in the Orenburg region, over 1,200 prisoners were executed in the last week of June 41 alone. The war gave Stalin a reason to continue the killings, and the chaos helped hide the evidence. Even while Soviet soldiers were dying on the front lines, the gulags remained killing grounds in the shadows. As the war came to an end in 1945, many hoped that the violence would end too. But instead, Stalin became even more suspicious and ruthless. One of the biggest fears was defection. Soviet soldiers who had been captured by the Germans were now seen as traitors, even though many had no choice. Stalin believed that if someone had survived captivity, they must have cooperated with the enemy. When these POWs returned home, they were not welcomed. Instead, they were arrested at transit stations, sent to camps, and in many cases, executed. In Vladivostok, the key port city in the Far East, over 4,000 repatriated soldiers were executed between 1946 and 1948. They had survived the horrors of Nazi camps, only to be shot by their own government. But it wasn't just soldiers. Civilians who had fled the war zones were also treated with suspicion. Anyone who had spent time in Western Europe, even as a refugee, was now labeled ideologically contaminated. In Tbilisi, Georgia, a group of 300 returning Red Cross nurses was arrested in 1946. Half of them were executed within the year, accused of spreading Western propaganda. In Moscow, Operation Vesna targeted Soviet citizens who had lived temporarily in Poland and Hungary. Between 1946 and 1947, over 9,000 civilians were arrested, and at least 2,500 were executed in secret. No one was trusted, and Stalin made sure those people were punished. But his end was also near. By the early 1950s, he was old ill, and increasingly paranoid. But the machine of executions did not slow down. In fact, it intensified once again. In 1951, NKVD records show over 12,000 executions inside Gulag camps. Many of these were tied to new purges targeting political prisoners, ethnic minorities, and suspected Western sympathizers. In Norilsk, a massive Gulag complex in Siberia, tensions had been growing for months. When prisoners organized small protests demanding more food and medical care, they were labeled as enemies. Over 400 inmates were executed within weeks, without trials, without public announcements. In Karaganda, Kazakhstan, a group of Polish and Ukrainian political prisoners were secretly shot after being accused of receiving foreign radio broadcasts. Their bodies were buried in a gravel pit near the camp fence. One of the last mass executions took place in Vorkuta, where over 200 prisoners were executed after a work strike in early 1952. The strike lasted only 2 days, but Stalin saw it as a rebellion. Even though his health was failing, Stalin continued signing death warrants. But on March 5, 1953, he died after suffering a stroke. He had ruled the Soviet Union with terror for nearly 30 years. His death sent shockwaves through the country. But inside the gulags, the reaction was different. Inmates, many of whom had spent decades in silence and fear, felt hope. Within days, the executions stopped. Power shifted quickly to Nikita Khrushchev and a few other senior leaders. These men knew that the system Stalin created had gone too far. Behind closed doors, they began dismantling parts of it. One of Khrushchev's first acts was to reduce the power of the NKVD, which had now become the KGB. He also ordered a review of past political cases. By 1954, mass releases began. Over 100,000 prisoners were freed within a year. In 1956, Khrushchev gave a speech, secret at the time, called the Secret Speech, where he admitted that Stalin had ordered countless illegal executions. Historians and family members were allowed limited access to records. Graves like Kuropatki, Levashovo, and Sandarmok were quietly acknowledged, though never fully explained by the government. Still, for thousands of families, it was too late. Husbands, wives, and children had already been killed and buried in nameless pits. But for those who had survived, it was a chance to finally speak, to tell the world what had been hidden, to say the names that had once been erased, and to make sure they were never forgotten again.